The moment three nations decide at the same time that American military aircraft are no longer welcome in their skies, history quietly shifts. At exactly 8:47 this morning, Venezuela's defense minister, Vladimir Pedrino Lopez, signed Decree 0847, formally closing Venezuelan airspace to all U.S. military and reconnaissance flights. Within 18 hours, Cuba mirrored the decision word for word. Shortly after, Iran announced the deployment of 4 warships to international waters off Venezuela's coast. This sequence was not accidental, nor was it the product of coincidence or diplomatic momentum. What unfolded was a coordinated act of military synchronization, carefully designed to shut down surveillance corridors the United States has treated as guaranteed since 1952. For the first time in modern history, 3 countries simultaneously activated advanced air defense systems and anti-access capabilities with the explicit purpose of challenging American air superiority in regions Washington has long considered uncontested. Having spent 11 years analyzing security structures in emerging markets of the International Monetary Fund, I have watched many attempts to push back against U.S. air dominance. China's forced landing of an American EP-3 surveillance aircraft in Hainan in 2001 was a shock. Bolivia's diversion of President Evo Morales' plane in 2013, based on suspicions of American intelligence involvement, was another signal. But never before have 3 states closed their airspace in unison, backed by modern layered defense systems, and done so with clear coordination. The scale of this action is difficult to overstate because it represents more than policy change. It marks the collapse of long-standing assumptions that American aircraft could operate freely near strategic targets with minimal risk. Venezuela has positioned 12 Russian S-300VM air defense missile batteries across 6 critical locations, each capable of tracking up to 100 targets simultaneously at ranges reaching 200 kilometers. Cuba has activated 4 Russian-built resonance radar systems designed to detect American stealth aircraft at distances up to 400 kilometers, dramatically extending early warning coverage. Iran has deployed its domestically produced Bavar 373 air defense systems, which offer capabilities comparable to Russia's S-400 platform. Combined, these systems form an integrated access denial network covering roughly 5 million square kilometers of strategically vital airspace. This network fundamentally alters the surveillance environment that has underpinned American hemispheric dominance since the early Cold War. The Pentagon's planning for generations has rested on the belief that U.S. aircraft could operate with relative freedom in international airspace adjacent to sensitive regions. That belief is now broken. What we are seeing is not a temporary disruption, but a structural shift in how air power functions when advanced defensive technology is paired with political coordination. To understand why this moment matters, it's necessary to look back at the historical patterns that led here. For decades, American airspace violations were treated as routine elements of security policy, gradually normalizing the idea that sovereignty could be overridden in the name of surveillance. During the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, U.S. U-2 spy planes conducted more than 400 documented flights over Cuba without authorization. On October 27, one of those aircraft was shot down, killing pilot Rudolph Anderson. Despite this, the United States never issued a formal apology for violating Cuban airspace. In 1988, the U.S. Navy shot down Iran Air Flight 655 over the Persian Gulf, killing all 290 people on board, including 66 children. The USS Vincennes fired 2 missiles from international waters while the commercial aircraft was on its scheduled route and ascending normally. The ship's captain later received the Legion of Merit, reinforcing perceptions that accountability for civilian losses was secondary to strategic posture. In Venezuela, airspace violations became increasingly systematic under the banner of counter-narcotics operations. In 2001, Venezuelan fighter jets intercepted an unauthorized American reconnaissance aircraft over Zulia province, leading President Hugo Chavez to lodge formal complaints with the Organization of American States. Radar data presented by Venezuela showed the aircraft conducting deliberate reconnaissance patterns for 42 minutes before interception. These incidents were not isolated, and by 2008, U.S. Southern Command acknowledged at least 17 unmanned reconnaissance flights over Venezuelan territory between 2004 and 2007. High-altitude Global Hawk drones monitored air bases and ports receiving Russian equipment without Venezuelan authorization. These accumulated actions set the stage for the coordinated response we are now witnessing, where sovereignty enforcement has moved from protest to capability. Iran's own confrontation with American surveillance reached a decisive turning point in 2011 when Iranian forces captured a U.S. RQ-170 Sentinel reconnaissance drone that had crossed into Iranian airspace from Afghanistan. Washington requested the return of the aircraft, citing the sensitive nature of its classified technology and its estimated $6 million value. Tehran refused and instead displayed the drone on national television, turning the incident into a statement about sovereignty rather than a technical dispute. More importantly, Iran reverse-engineered the platform and used it to develop the Shahed 171, its first stealth-capable combat drone. That system is no longer theoretical. Variants are now exported to Russia, Venezuela, and Cuba, demonstrating how surveillance violations can accelerate technological independence rather than enforce compliance. What we are seeing today is the result of lessons learned over decades. The air defense capabilities currently deployed by Venezuela, Cuba, and Iran represent a significant leap forward in access denial technology. Venezuela's S-300VM systems can engage targets at altitudes reaching 100 kilometers while tracking multiple threats at once, making traditional flight profile adjustments ineffective. Cuba's resonance radar network provides early warning that pushes detection far beyond what American planners previously assumed possible in the Caribbean. Iran's Bavar 373 systems, developed domestically, signal that advanced air defense no longer requires dependence on foreign suppliers, closing a vulnerability Washington once relied on to exert pressure through export controls. Together, these systems have reshaped the risk calculus for American reconnaissance operations, transforming routine surveillance missions into high-stakes decisions with real consequences. The Pentagon's immediate reaction exposed the depth of strategic confusion triggered by this coordinated action. Within 24 hours, Deputy Secretary of Defense Colin Kahl convened 2 emergency meetings to explore options for restoring reconnaissance capabilities without provoking shoot-down incidents. Every proposal reviewed was ultimately rejected, not because of hesitation, but because of hard technological and political constraints. The first option considered involved increasing flight altitudes while operating from neighboring international airspace. That approach failed because Russian radar systems deployed in Venezuela can track aircraft up to 50 kilometers in altitude, eliminating the safety margin altitude was once assumed to provide. A second option focused on expanding reliance on reconnaissance satellites, but the cost of approximately $300 million per launch made rapid scaling financially unrealistic. Satellite orbits are also predictable, allowing targets to adjust activity and avoid observation. The third proposal involved launching maritime reconnaissance aircraft from U.S. carriers positioned in the Caribbean. This plan collapsed after Iran warned that increased American military presence near Venezuela would trigger responses in the Strait of Hormuz. The message was clear: regional actions now carry global consequences. Coordinated resistance does not create a single problem for American planners. It creates multiple pressure points that force them to weigh trade-offs across theaters thousands of miles apart. Diplomatic efforts unraveled just as quickly. Secretary of State Antony Blinken attempted to defuse the situation through negotiation, offering partial relief from petroleum sanctions in exchange for Venezuela reversing its airspace closure. Within 2 hours, Venezuelan Foreign Minister Ivan Gil rejected the proposal outright. The response left little room for interpretation. Venezuela would not trade territorial sovereignty for economic incentives. The signal sent was broader than a single negotiation. It challenged the long-standing assumption that compliance could be purchased through sanctions relief or threatened through economic pressure. The strategic paradox now confronting Washington is that these 3 countries control surveillance corridors critical to several core American objectives. Venezuela sits astride reconnaissance routes used to monitor narcotics trafficking from Colombia into the Caribbean. Cuba dominates air and maritime observation over the Florida Straits, a passage through which roughly 40% of U.S. maritime trade flows. Iran exerts leverage over the Strait of Hormuz, the choke point for approximately 80% of Persian Gulf oil exports heading to Asian markets. These are not symbolic locations. They are arteries of global trade and security, and denying surveillance access along them reshapes how power is exercised. The economic consequences are immediate and measurable. Since 2001, the United States has invested roughly $140 billion in global air surveillance capabilities, built on the assumption of relatively unrestricted access to airspace near sensitive regions. Losing coverage over Venezuela alone is projected to cost U.S. Southern Command an additional $700 million per year to maintain equivalent intelligence through indirect means. Each mission now requires significantly more fuel, extended flight paths, and increased aerial refueling, driving up operational costs by more than 40%. Attempts to build alternative surveillance arrangements in the region have failed, one after another. Colombia declined requests to host expanded reconnaissance operations, citing new defense agreements with Mexico that prohibit supporting military actions against other Latin American states. Brazil continues to enforce constitutional bans on foreign military bases under any circumstances. Guyana briefly entertained American proposals to exchange advanced air defense technology for flight permissions, but suspended talks when Venezuela signaled it would revive territorial claims over the Essequibo region. Even at the diplomatic level, Washington found itself isolated. A resolution of the Organization of American States condemning Venezuela's airspace closure as a violation of navigation freedom collapsed when 18 Latin American countries voted against the U.S. position. Traditional allies showed growing reluctance to support surveillance operations they increasingly view as infringements on regional sovereignty rather than legitimate security measures. Efforts to reassert pressure through economic and political tools have proven just as ineffective. Threats of secondary sanctions against countries supplying air defense systems to Venezuela, Cuba, and Iran failed to alter the situation. Russia and China openly ignored the warnings and announced more than $4 billion in new weapons contracts with the three states. This outcome highlights a crucial shift in the global arms market. Alternative suppliers have reduced Washington's ability to control military technology transfers through sanctions, removing a key lever that once reinforced American strategic influence. When access to advanced defense systems is no longer monopolized, the cost of defiance drops sharply. This reality explains why the current alignment is not a temporary reaction, but part of a broader pattern. The theoretical framework I have developed over years of studying power transitions helps clarify why this coordinated response was not only predictable, but likely inevitable. Dominant powers attempt to maximize relative strength by controlling regions closest to them geographically. However, when a hegemon extends military commitments across multiple continents while facing resistance in its own hemisphere, it creates exploitable vulnerabilities. The United States maintains extensive obligations in Europe, East Asia, and the Middle East. At the same time, it lacks the spare capacity to concentrate overwhelming force in the Western Hemisphere without weakening its posture elsewhere. This dispersion of resources opens the door for secondary powers to coordinate resistance in ways that would be impossible if American power were regionally concentrated. Kenneth Waltz's balancing theory provides further insight into why Venezuela, Cuba, and Iran have aligned despite lacking deep ideological compatibility. When one state accumulates excessive power, others tend to form balancing coalitions driven by security needs rather than shared values. All three countries perceive the United States as an existential threat to their political survival. Under those conditions, coordination becomes a rational strategy, regardless of differences in political systems, religion, or regional priorities. What binds them is not ideology, but vulnerability. The consequences of this alignment extend far beyond the immediate loss of airspace access. Two foundational pillars that sustained American global surveillance dominance are eroding simultaneously. The first pillar was technological superiority and reconnaissance, built on a combination of satellites, manned aircraft, and unmanned drones capable of observing virtually any region of the world. That system relied on relatively free access to international airspace near strategic targets. By deploying air defense systems capable of engaging non-stealth aircraft within 200 kilometers, Venezuela, Cuba, and Iran have effectively eliminated that access. Replacing current platforms with a fully stealth-based reconnaissance fleet would require investments approaching $400 million per aircraft, making comprehensive replacement financially impractical at scale. The second pillar involved deterrence through persistent presence. For decades, American strategy assumed that constant surveillance would discourage regional actors from taking actions Washington deemed threatening. That deterrence depended on the belief that U.S. monitoring was unavoidable. When three countries demonstrate they can deny American air access without immediate retaliation, that belief collapses. Without persistent observation, the psychological effect of surveillance fades, and so does its deterrent value. This shift is already influencing other states facing American pressure. Algeria is negotiating the purchase of Russian S-400 air defense systems. Pakistan is exploring China's HQ-9 platform. Nicaragua has formally requested Russian Panzer S-1 systems. Each case reflects the same calculation. Access denial technology combined with coordination offers a viable path to defending sovereignty. The so-called domino effect is driven by recognition that even modest economies can protect their airspace when they adopt the right technologies and align with others facing similar challenges. This marks a fundamental change in how middle powers approach relations with dominant states, moving away from accommodation and toward active resistance when credible defensive options exist. The financial implications reach beyond surveillance budgets into the broader sustainability of America's global military posture. If multiple regions adopt effective anti-access strategies and coordinate their responses, the cost of maintaining worldwide reconnaissance and deterrence could exceed available resources, even for the largest defense budget in history. Technology has altered the balance in subtle but decisive ways. Modern radar systems, surface-to-air missiles, and electronic warfare tools have matured to the point where they neutralize traditional advantages once enjoyed by advanced air forces. Persistent surveillance has become riskier and more expensive, reducing its utility as a default instrument of power. These developments also raise difficult questions for alliances like NATO, where credibility depends in part on the assumption of American air superiority. If the model demonstrated by Venezuela, Cuba, and Iran spreads, partners may begin to question whether security guarantees based on surveillance dominance remain reliable. This uncertainty adds another layer of strain to alliance management at a time when strategic challenges are multiplying rather than receding. Beyond hardware and budgets, there is a powerful information dimension shaping how this moment is interpreted and replicated. The coordinated airspace closure was never intended to speak to a single audience. It sends simultaneous messages to American defense planners, to regional governments considering similar steps, to domestic populations within all three countries, and to neutral states watching closely to see whether resistance carries consequences. For Washington, the message is that surveillance is no longer a low-risk, routine activity. For regional actors, it demonstrates that collective action backed by credible technology can alter long-standing power relationships. For domestic audiences in Venezuela, Cuba, and Iran, it reinforces narratives of sovereignty and self-determination after decades of perceived intrusion. And for neutral countries, it offers a case study in how coordination can offset asymmetry. This information effect may prove as influential as the physical denial of airspace itself, because it reframes what is considered possible for states operating outside the traditional circle of great powers. What is emerging goes beyond isolated policy decisions and begins to resemble an alternative security architecture. The coordination between Venezuela, Cuba, and Iran, supported by Russian and Chinese defense technology, functions independently of American-led systems and institutions. It does not rely on NATO frameworks, U.S. logistics, or Western intelligence networks. Instead, it emphasizes layered defense, regional cooperation, and strategic messaging aimed at deterring intrusion rather than projecting power outward. This model challenges the assumption that security must flow through U.S.-centered alliances to be effective. It also complicates Washington's ability to respond, because dismantling such networks would require simultaneous escalation across multiple regions, each with its own risks and global repercussions. The transformation underway is therefore not confined to air defense. It reflects a broader rethinking of how states protect sovereignty in an era where advanced technology is no longer exclusive to a handful of militaries. The implications for American global strategy are profound. For decades, air superiority and surveillance dominance allowed the United States to compensate for political uncertainty on the ground. Even when relationships were strained, constant monitoring provided confidence that threats could be detected early and managed from a distance. That confidence is now eroding. When access is denied without triggering retaliation, the credibility of surveillance-based deterrence weakens. The Pentagon has not publicly acknowledged that global air dominance is becoming financially and technologically unsustainable, but internal actions suggest an awareness that a transition is already underway. Resources are increasingly stretched across competing priorities from Europe to the Indo-Pacific, leaving limited capacity to reassert dominance in the Western Hemisphere without unacceptable trade-offs elsewhere. This tension underscores a central dilemma. Maintaining global reach requires concentration of resources, yet concentration in one region risks exposure in another. What Venezuela, Cuba, and Iran have demonstrated is not merely resistance to American policy, but a broader lesson about power in the modern era. Middle-income states, when equipped with appropriate defensive systems and aligned with others facing similar pressures, can meaningfully defend territorial sovereignty against far stronger opponents. This does not require matching offensive capabilities or projecting force abroad. It requires denying access, raising costs, and coordinating responses so that pressure in one area creates consequences in another. That strategy is already being studied and adapted elsewhere. As more countries observe its effectiveness, the incentive to follow a similar path grows, especially where domestic politics favor autonomy over alignment. The result is a gradual shift away from a system defined by unilateral dominance toward one characterized by contested access and negotiated boundaries. The broader transformation now taking shape suggests that this moment will be remembered less for a single decree or deployment and more for what it revealed about the limits of power in a changing strategic environment. The coordination between Venezuela, Cuba, and Iran illustrates how the foundations of air power are being reorganized, not through large-scale wars or dramatic confrontations, but through deliberate choices to acquire defensive technology and synchronize policy with others facing comparable pressures. This approach avoids direct conflict while steadily eroding the advantages that once made surveillance and reconnaissance instruments of uncontested dominance. The result is a quiet but decisive shift in how control of airspace is contested, where denial replaces dominance and cost imposition replaces escalation. For American planners, this reality forces a reassessment of assumptions that have guided strategy for more than 7 decades. Air superiority can no longer be treated as a baseline condition, and surveillance can no longer be assumed to operate without meaningful resistance. The financial and strategic implications of this shift extend well beyond the Western Hemisphere. If access denial becomes normalized across multiple regions, the cumulative burden of maintaining global surveillance could exceed even the United States' vast defense resources. Each denied corridor requires workarounds that are more expensive, less efficient, and more politically sensitive. Over time, this erodes the return on investment of systems designed for an earlier era when technological gaps were wider and coordination among secondary powers was weaker. The lesson being absorbed worldwide is that defensive systems now offer disproportionate leverage. Advanced radar, missile technology, and electronic warfare can neutralize advantages that once required decades and trillions of dollars to build. As these tools spread, the strategic environment becomes less permissive for any power relying on persistent presence as a deterrent. This has cascading effects on alliance credibility, crisis management, and global stability, because surveillance gaps introduce uncertainty where confidence once existed. The coordinated action by Venezuela, Cuba, and Iran also reshapes how sovereignty is understood and enforced. Rather than relying on diplomatic protest or legal argument alone, these states have demonstrated that sovereignty can be defended technologically when political will aligns with capability. This approach reframes international norms by showing that airspace control is not merely a legal claim, but a practical one, enforced through systems that raise the cost of violation beyond what routine policy can absorb. As more countries internalize this lesson, the balance between freedom of navigation and respect for territorial boundaries will be renegotiated in practice, not theory. The emerging pattern suggests a world where access is conditional, surveillance is contested, and power projection must account for coordinated resistance rather than isolated defiance. What ultimately stands out is not the end of American influence, but the end of American exclusivity in shaping the rules of aerial access. The 72-year era in which U.S. aircraft operated with near impunity across the hemisphere has quietly closed. What replaces it will determine whether surveillance and reconnaissance remain central tools of global power or evolve into expensive, limited instruments used selectively rather than routinely. The transition is already underway, unfolding through policy decisions, procurement choices, and strategic partnerships rather than dramatic confrontation. History often turns on moments that seem technical at the time, but later reveal deeper structural change. This is one of those moments. The foundations of air dominance have shifted, and the consequences will shape how power is exercised, resisted, and negotiated in the decades ahead.